Probably more often than not, I try and at least be topic relevant in terms of lessons that I try and share with the church, obviously from a biblical perspective, but want to make the word seem relevant to you instead of going through some sort of predetermined lesson and message guideline or scriptures. I tend to bounce around back and forth, sometimes driven by circumstances. And circumstances of late have been interesting, scary, or whatever adjective you want to describe for it. But there's a certain level of anger throughout the nation, whether it's because of racism, whether it's because of people being pent up because of the COVID-19, whatever the circumstances are, there's just this pent up expression that is manifesting itself in so many different ways, some in peaceful protests, some in tearing down statues, whatever the case might be. So I thought that I would deliver a lesson to you about the feelings of wanting to maybe retaliate or get back, because we think perhaps some of these circumstances and some of the things that people are doing don't seem quite right, so we need to help God out here. So the lesson this morning is denominated Retaliation, and it's taken from Romans chapter 12, verses 14 through 21. Bless your enemies. No cursing under your breath. Laugh with your happy friends when they're happy. Share tears when they're down. Get along with each other. Don't be stuck up. Make friends with nobodies. Don't be the great somebody. Don't hit back, but instead discover beauty in everyone. If you've got it in you, get along with everybody. Don't insist on getting even. That's not what you do. I'll do the judging, God says. I'll take care of that. Our scriptures tell us that if you see your enemy hungry, go buy that person lunch. Or if he's thirsty, get him a drink. Your generosity will surprise him with goodness. Don't let evil get the best of you. Get the best of evil by doing good. We have some friends, Todd, and you grew up in Oklahoma. The most sacred symbol in Oklahoma City is a tree. It's this sprawling, shade-bearing, 80-year-old American elm. And tourists drive from miles around just to see this tree. People pose for pictures beneath it. Arborists carefully nurture and protect it. The tree adorns posters and letterhead. Other trees in the area grow taller, maybe even fuller, or perhaps even greener than this particular tree, but none of them is as cherished as this tree. The city treasures this tree, not for its appearance, but because of its endurance. Because this particular tree endured the Oklahoma City bombing. Timothy McVeigh, if you remember the name, parked his death-laden truck only yards from that particular tree. And his malice killed 168 people, wounded 850 others, and destroyed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The explosion also buried this tree under tons of rubble. No one expected ever for that tree to survive. Fact is, no one gave any thought, really, to this dusty, branch-stripped tree. But then it began to bud. Sprouts pressed through the bark that had been damaged. Green leaves were starting to push away the gray soot from the explosion. Life was resurrected from an acre of death. And people noticed that. The tree modeled the resilience that the victims of the Oklahoma City bombing desired. So they gave the tree a name. And the name of the tree is the survivor tree. And the truth is, church, the Timothy McVeighs of this world are going to rock us. They inexcusably and inexplicably maim and potentially scar us. And we want desperately to imitate that tree. We want to survive the evil. We want to rise above the ruin. But how? Well, one of my favorite Old Testament characters is David, and David can give us some ideas. You see, when Saul, the king then, kind of McVeigh'd his way into David's world, David fled to the desert where he found a hiding place and refuge among a bunch of caves. And this is in the area of the Dead Sea. Several hundred loyalists followed David, and unfortunately so did Saul. And in two dramatic desert scenes, David, I think, models how to give grace to the very people who give us grief. Here's the first scene. Saul has now signaled for his men to stop, so they do. There are 3,000 soldiers with Saul. They cease their marching as their king dismounts and walks up a mountainside. The region of En-Gedi where this happened is just simmering in brick oven hot heat. Sun rays strike like daggers on the soldiers' backs and their weapons. Lizards are lying behind rocks. Scorpions are lingering out in the dirt. And snakes, just like Saul, seek rest in caves. Now, Saul enters into this cave, according to 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 3, to relieve himself. Now David and his men were hiding far back in the cave. So get the picture. David and his men are in the deep recesses of a cave. Saul, who is trying to kill David, needs to go to the bathroom. So he finds a cave outside of the sight of his soldiers, says, "Here, wait for me," while he takes care of business. And David and his men are in this cave, and they're watching Saul relieve himself. And I'm thinking that maybe with eyes likely dulled by the sun, Saul fails to notice the silent figures who are lining the walls of this cave. But because they've been in the cave, their eyes have adjusted and they see Saul. So as Saul is heeding nature's call, dozens of eyes are now widened. Their minds are racing. Their hands are reaching for their daggers. One thrust of a blade would bring Saul's tyranny, and they're running to a very quick and understandable and sought-after end. But David signals for his men to hold back. He edges along the wall, unsheaths his knife, and cuts not the flesh of Saul, but the robe of the king. David then creeps back into the recesses of the cave. And I'm assuming that David's men probably can't believe what they've just watched David do. And I'm thinking maybe David doesn't even know exactly why he did what he did, but his feelings are just the opposite of his men. They think he has done too little because they believe that he should have taken Saul out. David thinks he's done too much. Rather than gloat, David regrets. And later, David felt guilty because he'd cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Here's what he said to his men in 1 Samuel 24, verses 5 and 6. "May the Lord keep me from doing such a thing to my master. Saul is the Lord's appointed king. I should not do anything against him, because he is the Lord's appointed king." So after this little incident, Saul exits the cave, and David and his men follow him not long thereafter. And David lifts up the corner of the garment that he had cut off from King Saul, and in so many words tells Saul, I could have killed you, but I didn't. Saul looks up, he's stunned, and wonders aloud, and we have this recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 19. This is Saul talking now. If a man finds his enemy, will he let him get away safely? And the answer is, yeah, David will. And the answer further is, more than once. Because here's the second scene. Just a couple of chapters later, in 1 Samuel chapter 26, Saul once again is trying to hunt down David and kill him. David once again has outwitted Saul at every turn of the journey. David and a soldier kind of stealth their way through the ranks at night until they are standing directly over the snoring body of King Saul. The soldier begs. 1 Samuel 26, verse 8. Here's what he tells David. This is the moment. God has put your enemy in your grasp. Let me nail him to the ground with his spear. One hit will do it, believe me. I won't need a second. But again, David won't have it. Rather than taking Saul's life, he takes Saul's spear and his water jug, and he and his comrade sneak out of camp. And then, from a safe distance, he awakens Saul and the soldiers with an announcement. Again, 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 23. God put your life in my hands today, but I wasn't willing to lift a finger against God's anointed. You see, once again, David has spared Saul's life. Once again, David has displayed this really God-saturated mind. Who dominates David's thoughts? Well, look at 1 Samuel chapter 26, verses 23 and 24. May the Lord delivered, the Lord's anointed, in the eyes of the Lord. Who is David thinking about? He says God dominates his thinking. 4 times in 2 separate verses, he makes reference to the Lord. And sometimes we think about the purveyors of the pain in our own lives. I mean, it is one thing to give grace to friends, but to give grace to people who give us grief? I mean, can you do that? Given a few uninterrupted moments with the Darth Vaders of your life, could you imitate David? Maybe. Some people just seem graced with like mercy glands, and they can do that. They seem to secrete forgiveness, never harboring grudges or reciting their hurts to anybody at any time. Others of us, likely most of us, find it hard to forgive the Sauls in our life. We forgive the one-time offenders, sure. We dismiss the parking place takers in the grocery store, no problem. Maybe we forgive the date breakers and even the purse snatchers. We can move past misdemeanors, but when you get to the felonies, can you get beyond that? The repeat offenders, the Sauls who have taken your youth or your retirement or your health. Where that scoundrel to seek shade in your cave or lie sleeping at your feet, would you do what David did? Could you forgive that scum who hurt you? The problem is that failure to forgive can be fatal. In Job chapter 5, verse 2, Job says, resentment kills a fool, and envy slays the simple. You see, vengeance fixes your attention on life's ugliest moments. Score settling freezes your stare at the cruel events of things that have happened to you in the past. But is that where you really want to be looking? Will rehearsing and reliving your hurts and your fears make you a better person? No. According to Job, it'll just destroy you. You don't think so? Well, do you remember that old comedy routine where Joe complains to Jerry about this irritating habit of a mutual friend? The guy constantly pokes his finger in Joe's chest as he talks, and that just bothers Joe unbelievably. It drives him crazy. So he resolves to get even. He shows his friend Jerry a small bottle of highly explosive nitroglycerin that he has tied to a string. And he explains, I'm going to wear this around my neck, letting the bottle hang over the exact spot where I keep getting poked. Because next time he sticks his finger in my chest, he will pay for it. Well, not nearly as much as Joe will, right? I mean, enemy destroyers need two graves. It is foolish to harbor a grudge. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 9. An eye for an eye then becomes a neck for a neck, or a job for a job, or a reputation for a reputation. I mean, when does it ever stop? It stops when one person imitates David's God-dominated mind. He faced Saul the way he faced his Goliath, by facing God even more. When the soldiers in the cave urged David to kill Saul, look who occupied David's thoughts. Again, 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 6. The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. When David called out to Saul from the mouth of the cave, it says in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 8, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed down. Then he reiterated his conviction. Verse 10, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. And in the second scene, during the nighttime campsite attack, David maintains the same belief. 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 9. Who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? In these two scenes, there are 6 separate times when David refers to Saul as the Lord's anointed. Now, can you think of another term that David might have used? Yeah, I could. And I certainly wouldn't call him the Lord's anointed. Try another adjective, far more harsh in its description. But not David. You see, he saw not Saul the enemy, but Saul the anointed. He refused to see his grief giver as anything less than a child of God. David didn't applaud Saul's behavior by any stretch of the imagination. He just acknowledged who Saul's proprietor is, God. David filtered his view of Saul through this grid of heaven that he had. The king still belonged to God, and that gave reason for David to continue to have hope. Many years ago, a German Shepherd wolf mix, the dog's name was Cujo, attacked my youngest son William on his way to elementary school. And this absolutely worthless animal, completely unprovoked, climbed out of its run in his front yard and onto the sidewalk and nearly killed William. The dog left my son with dozens of cuts and gashes, all of which required stitches, the number of which I cannot even begin to recall. My feelings toward that cur were less than Davidic, I'll say that. Leave the two of us in a cave, and only one would have exited, and it would not have been that dog. In fact, I told the Humane Society to put the dog down, because this wasn't the first time the dog had attacked. But I was asked to reconsider. What that dog did was horrible, but the owner's still training him. They're not finished with him yet. I was, but the owner wasn't. And God would say the same thing about that shepherd-wolf mix that attacked you. What he did, what she did, was unthinkable. It was unacceptable. It was inexcusable. But they're not finished yet. Your enemies still figure into God's plan. The proof is they still have a pulse. God hasn't given up on them. They may be out of God's will, definitely, but not out of God's reach. You honor God when you see them, not as failures, but as God's projects. Besides, who assigned us the task of getting back, or getting even, or getting retribution? David understood that, I think. From the mouth of the cave, he declared, "May the Lord decide between you and me. May the Lord take revenge on you for what you did to me. However, I will not lay a hand on you. The Lord must be the judge. He will decide." 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 12 and 15. And God did. God did decide. God took out Saul. God occupies the only seat on the Supreme Court of heaven. He wears the robe, and he refuses to share the gavel with anybody. For this reason, Paul wrote in Romans chapter 12, verse 19, "Don't insist on getting even. That's not for you to do. I'll do the judging," God says. "I'll take care of it." You see, revenge removes God from the equation. Vigilantes, desiring to get this comeuppance or this payback, displace and replace God. I'm not so sure if you can handle this one, God. You may punish a little too lightly or a little too slowly. I'll take this matter into my own hands. I think I will take care of it. Thank you very much. And isn't that what you want to say sometimes? You know, interestingly, Jesus didn't. No one had a clearer sense of right and wrong than the perfect Son of God. Yet, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23, when he suffered, he didn't make any threats, but left everything to the one who judges fairly. You see, only God assesses accurate judgments. We impose punishments that are too light or too severe. God dispenses perfect justice. Vengeance or retribution is his job. So leave your enemies in God's hands. You're not endorsing their misbehavior when you do. You can hate what someone did without letting hatred consume you in the process. Forgiveness, church, is not excusing. And forgiveness is not pretending. David didn't gloss over or sidestep Saul's sin. He addressed it head on, directly. He didn't avoid the issue, but he did avoid Saul. 1 Samuel 24, verse 22, Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. You get the distinct impression that after that little encounter, Saul goes this way, David goes this way. And maybe we should do the same. Give grace, but if need be, keep your distance. You can forgive the abusive husband or the abusive friend or the abusive spouse without living with them. You can be quick to give mercy to an immoral politician, but be slow to give him or her another term. Just don't elect him. Society can dispense grace and prison terms at the same time. For instance, offer the drunk driver a second chance, but keep his license and his keys. Forgiveness is not foolishness. Forgiveness is at its core choosing to see your offender through very different eyes. When some Moravian missionaries took the message of God to the Eskimos, the missionaries struggled to find a word in the native language for forgiveness. They finally landed on this cumbersome 24-letter choice. Try and pronounce that. Sumaji Jujung Ninermike. This formidable assembly of letters is literally translated, quote, not being able to think about it anymore. You see, forgiveness is to move on. It's not to think about the offense anymore. You don't excuse him. You don't endorse her. You don't embrace them. You just route thoughts about them through heaven. You see your enemy as God's child and revenge as God's job. And frankly, how can we grace recipients, which Steve addressed this morning, do anything less? I mean, dare we ask God for grace when we refuse to give it? This is a huge issue in the Scriptures. Jesus was really tough on sinners who refused to forgive other sinners. Remember his story about the servant who had been freshly forgiven a debt of millions, who refused to forgive a debt equal to a few $100s. That stirred the wrath of God. Because Jesus, in giving this parable, says in Matthew chapter 18, verses 32 and 33, this was the king who had forgiven the debt, speaking, but the truth remains the same. You evil servant, I forgave you a tremendous debt. Shouldn't you have mercy just as I had mercy on you? You see, in the final analysis, I think we give grace because we've been given grace. We survive because we try and imitate that survivor tree. We reach our roots beyond the bomb zone. We tap into the moisture beyond the explosions. We dig deeper and deeper and deeper until we draw moisture from the mercy of God. And we, like Saul, have all been given grace. And we, like Saul, can also choose to give it. These are difficult times. I was talking with Arlene, and if you read the newspapers and listen to the radio and all the other statistics that are going up, there seems to be maybe some sort of potential resurgence. So are they going to close churches down again? I don't know. And frankly, it's exhausting to try and keep track of all the data and all the numbers and all the rules and all the regulations. I do my best, but sometimes it just is exhausting. And between Justin and I, we talk about these things quite a bit. And as an attorney, that's kind of my job, is to read statutes and try and understand them and give interpretation to them And I will tell you, quite honestly, when I read some of the stuff associated with the CDC and COVID and all this other kind of stuff, it is a conundrum. I wrestle with these statutes to arrive at a conclusion like, I don't know what it means. I don't know what the rules are. I don't know what's going to happen next, and it's exhausting. So the approach that I've taken is, I'm just going to leave it in God's hands, try and be as conscientious a steward as I can, to encourage the church where I worship to join me in worship. But if these rules and regulations affect you differently, I'm fine with that. We're making available to you alternative ways in which you can enjoy and hopefully participate in a worship experience. That's all your church leadership can do. And so I'll leave the rest of it to God. Put it in His hands. I mean, there's a part of me that would like to hug on each one of you, shake your hand, and just say, it's in God's hands. He'll protect me. But by the same token, I need to model the behavior that our government has suggested, so I do. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's in God's hands. But when it comes to forgiving, it's in your hands. And if we labor with grudges and carry them around like a bag of rocks, it destroys your happiness. And frankly, we're in times where it's difficult to find happiness. So lighten your load. Forgive others. Don't seek retribution or vengeance, because it'll just eat you alive and eventually kill you. And that's not where we want to go. So thank you for being here. Maybe for some of you, it constitutes a big risk in your health. I know there are others who are not here because they are very hypersensitive to being in a room with people who are not their family. And I mean biological family. So they choose not to be here. That's okay. Grace to them too. So for you, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming and worshiping. Thank you for making this important in your life. And the leadership here is trying to do everything we can to provide for your safety and for your comfort, to think outside the box, to be creative in terms of a worship experience, and keep praying for this church. But most importantly, if you would, pick up the phone this week, call somebody who's not here, encourage them, find out how they're doing, see if there's something you can do to help. So we picked a song, it's called an invitation song. It's kind of old school. At a time, way back, 60s, 50s, 70s, it was an opportunity for people to come forward and maybe confess sins or want to be baptized or something like that. And that still happens from time to time. But I think of an invitation song as an invitation for you to think about God's word that was expressed to you today, and then let it kind of permeate your life, and then encourage you to act on it this week going forward. So we're going to sing this song. I have a prayer request. If you have others, you can bring them forward. I'll take them from you. We'll pray about them, and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand and let's sing.